Welcome to the Economy Magazine at I-24 News, where we give you a daily view on the biggest stories in global business and innovation. I'm Natalie Ehrlich. Well, coming up, renovations to the Panama Canal could double capacity. And the political crisis in Burundi shakes its economy. Well, let's start now with the headlines. Eurozone finance chiefs have another chance on Thursday to break the impasse with Greece. Gathering in Luxembourg for their monthly get-together, ministers will address policy overhauls and budget cuts Athens must undertake in exchange for much-needed cash. The Eurozone portion of Greece's €245 bailout expires at the end of the month. And on the same day, Athens is required to pay back €1.5 billion to the IMF, a payment it won't be able to make without a new aid transfer. But big differences divide Greece and Europe. Creditors say Greece must adopt austerity, which Greece says would push it even deeper into recession.
Unlike Greece, Ireland, Spain and Portugal successfully concluded their aid programs, and they are once again on their own feet. Cyprus, too, is on a good path.
Well, in the U.S., Fed Chief Janet Yellen stressed caution against hiking rates just yet during the central bank's policy meeting on Wednesday. The Fed wants to see higher inflation and a better jobs outlook first, suggesting it may only raise rates by a quarter percentage point this year. Originally, many officials had anticipated rates could go up twice in 2015.
The committee continues to judge that the first increase in the federal funds rate will be appropriate when it is seen further improvement in the labor market and is reasonably confident that inflation will move back to its 2% objective over the medium term. At our meeting that ended today, the committee concluded that these conditions have not yet been achieved.
Signs of hope for China's real estate market. China's National Bureau of Statistics reported the price of new homes fell 5.7% year-on-year in May. The prices went up 0.2% month-on-month, the first positive reading since April 2014. Well, China's weak property market is considered one of the major risks for that economy. Economic growth slowed to a 6-year low of 7% in the first quarter, putting more pressure on Beijing to boost stimulus. And at the Paris Air Show on Thursday, Hungary's Wizz Air committed to buy 110 Airbus A321neo aircraft, said to be worth some $13.7 billion. Now, this deal calls for 110 firm deliveries and purchase rights for another 90 aircraft. The jetliners will be delivered between 2019 to 2024, making it the biggest single order for this model. Wizz Air currently operates 61 aircraft on over 380 routes from 22 bases focused on Central and Eastern Europe. Almost complete renovations to the Panama Canal will double its capacity, allowing 3 times as much cargo to pass through, reports Shelby Weinecker.
The Panama Canal, a 100-year-old passage, has recently seen some major construction and expansion. The canal will connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by raising ships 26 meters above sea level. Its new locks will take water through a series of artificial lakes that will recycle water as it moves through its basins. The almost complete renovations will double the capacity and allow 3 times as much cargo to pass through.
In a matter of 3 or 4 months, the expansion will be practically finished. The locks can hold water and can be operated locally to allow cargo ships through by the year's end, although it may not be open to commercial boats.
There is a rush for the expansion to be completed after a year of delays. Labor and cost disputes plagued the refurbishment, along with fears that an interruption could set back shipping companies worldwide and cost Panama millions of dollars in lost shipping tolls. Many were happy to see the first operational tests begin.
It's a very emotional moment for those who have been here so many years. It's the result of 5 years of work, very hard work. The people have worked so hard, so frantically these past weeks for everything to be ready.
The race to complete the canal expansion became heated when Nicaragua began construction on a Chinese-built $50 billion rival canal, expected to open within 5 years. The Panama Canal expansion was expected to cost over $5 billion, but overruns have already increased it to nearly $7 billion. Maritime trade competition will continue to rise as the Panama expansion becomes more competitive with the alternative Suez.
Well, things just got worse for FIFA. Banks in Switzerland recently reporting 53 possible acts of money laundering in the probe of FIFA's 2018 and 2022 World Cup bids. Now, for a closer look at these investigations and economic perspective, we're joined on set by Sam Chester of investment firm Clarity Capital. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
So what are the economic consequences of these probes?
Well, I would start by, let's take a step back and realize the economic reach of FIFA. We're talking about an agency which is, in many ways, you can compare it almost to the World Bank, except unlike the World Bank, it also more or less dominates a particular economic sector, you know, football or soccer in that sense. And the other area that you have to understand is that it's often applied around the world in countries where the rule of law and corruption are particularly egregious. So if you look at the areas where the World Cup has been hosted in the last few years, you're talking about South Africa, Russia in 2018, Qatar in 2022. So those are why you sort of see this convergence of power, economic and political power, and also areas where, you know, the rule of law is very weak. But you asked about economic impact, and I would identify 4 areas in particular. The very first one is looking at the sponsors. FIFA has brought in over the last 4 or 5 years billions and billions of dollars. It's dependent upon its sponsors in order to exist in its organization. Those sponsors are now coming under intense heat. They're putting intense heat on FIFA. We saw Visa recently has threatened to pull its sponsorship, and others are sure to follow. So sponsors is one area that's very interesting. I would just maybe add one last thing to that. If you think back a few years ago, when Tiger Woods came under investigation for some of his sexual improprieties, research shows that companies who were sponsoring him, who then all canceled, they lost market capitalization of up to $10 billion. So that sort of shows the scope of damage on the sponsorship side. Very briefly, beyond sponsorship, I would say we have the area of the banking system. The money that was laundered ran through the U.S. banking system, and other areas as well that we can discuss.
Indeed, these are huge liabilities for corporations, but staying on the U.S. front, which actually was the first to initiate these investigations, do you think that they're potentially going to look into other global bodies that cover sports?
For sure. So I guess I would put it in 2 ways. One, there's, the issue of the U.S. banks. Many of the U.S. banks are already being discussed. None of them have been indicted yet, but J.P. Morgan, USBC, others, they're already under early investigation by the U.S. justice system for improprieties, and that's a serious concern for them that could be worth billions of dollars in fines. But in terms of other sports organizations, let's remember 10, 15 years ago when the Olympics came under scrutiny for the bribery scandals involved in 2002, the Salt Lake City Olympic Games. The Olympics, fortunately, did clean up their act, and after firing and making many people resign, ultimately turned a corner. FIFA doesn't seem like they're prepared to follow in the Olympics example.
Well, you mentioned the banks here. I mean, do you think that they really didn't know what the purpose of these transfers were?
So that's what they're being accused of. No one is suggesting that the banks were directly involved in the money laundering per se, but at the same time, banks can be held accountable if they more or less kind of look the other way and if they don't scrutinize it enough. And that's something which banks just a few weeks ago have paid billions of dollars in fines to the U.S. justice system. Let's remember the U.S. financial system is of such scope that it can hold companies and banks responsible even if they don't sit in the U.S. and even if they don't directly do business in the U.S. And that's sort of the power and the breadth of the U.S. system.
Right. Well, how will this impact the financial markets?
It's a great question. On the one hand, you would think, well, this is something happening in the sports world, perhaps, and maybe in sponsoring world, but how will it really impact markets? The one direct way will be the sponsoring companies. As I mentioned earlier, companies can lose millions and billions even of dollars if they're tied into a scandal, so they're going to already hedge away. The second area, though, of course, is Qatar. Qatar is a country that, when it won the 2022 World Cup, was seen with a lot of scrutiny. How could a country of such small size, a desert country, host an event in the middle of the summer? Already in the days after the arrests of the senior FIFA officials, Qatar's stock market, its ETF fund, both fell by several market points. And with the country of Qatar having invested, I think, up to $200 billion for the World Cup Games in 2022. If they lose the games, it could have severe repercussions on their banking sector, on the real estate sector, and other areas as well.
Indeed. Well, we will be looking eagerly for that. Thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it very much.
It's a pleasure.
Moving on now to the rest of our coverage, Burundi's political crisis is devastating for the country's already fragile economy.
Activity has ground to a halt at this rice depot in Burundi's capital, Bujumbura. A few weeks ago, police came to close it down accusing the manager of selling rice to protesters.
Before, I was going home with more than $3 in my pocket because I'm in charge of loading the rice. But today it's a nightmare. I can't even make 1 cent.
Burundi's political crisis began in April and is shaking the country's already fragile economy. It started when President Pierre Nkurunziza announced he would run for a controversial third term. Street violence has forced many shops and factories to shut, with some having to lay off staff. And weeks of protests have disrupted supplies, so prices have soared.
The cost of all products has risen. Today we have to work really hard to buy enough to eat. The price of rice, flour, tomatoes, it's all shot up.
At this market in Bujumbura, customers are scarce.
Today, customers come in dribs and drabs. Really, it's like nothing works here. Whereas before you could go home with a good amount of money, now whole days can pass without selling a thing.
According to analysts, an end to the violence won't necessarily bring an end to Burundi's economic crisis. Many fear a win by the president could provoke further aid cuts by international donors, risking isolation that would only deepen its woes.
And for the stories we wanted to make sure you wouldn't miss, we're joined on set by Daniel Roth. What do you have for us today?
First story is coming from The Atlantic, and I'm sure that the situation in Burundi is contributing to this. 50 million people in the world are refugees or displaced people. An enormous, enormous number. I was just talking to someone outside of the newsroom who said, that sounds about right. And I said, well, actually, when you put it another way, 1 in 133 people on Earth is a refugee or displaced. And he said, wow, that is huge. And the cost of this, first of all, the cost of this is enormous to livelihoods, to health, to environment, across the board. When you put it in dollar figures, the estimation is somewhere around $100 billion that this costs per year to the world. So it's just an enormous, enormous number of people without homes, essentially.
This is the greatest number of displaced people ever, correct?
Well, it's the greatest number since World War II. Okay. World War II, of course, was enormous displacement, enormous creation of refugees. We're surprised to see it. You know, we hear this argument about whether the world is essentially getting more peaceful or more violent, and this really sort of informs you that it's going one way. Now, the second story we have from The Telegraph actually talks about this. $14 trillion is the cost of international violence every year. So that's 13% of the world's GDP. $14 trillion is the cost. And this article actually explains that, in fact, half of the world is getting more peaceful, while half of the world is getting more violent.
And it's pretty split down the middle between the peaceful section of the world and the violent section, which was pretty surprising to me.
Right. It's about 86 countries around the world are going higher on the peace index, and 76 are getting lower, meaning they're getting more violent. So what we're seeing is, in this trend that we see across the board in our research, in our stories, in the economy show that we do here, is that as inequality is rising, so too is the inequality of who experiences a life of peace and who experiences a life of violence. And again, the cost across the board is enormous.
And something that also segues into the first piece that you mentioned that really surprised me is that these countries that are in fact the most violent have the densest populations.
Absolutely. It's a lot about space. It's a lot about resources. You know, as we know, economics is the study of how we organize our resources, essentially. And when there's not good governments, when there's not good organization and too many people vying for too few things, you see violence grow. and the costs essentially go up.
Well, what else do you have for us on the menu?
Changing tunes in a big way and going to the U.S. actually. Uber is, the famous ride-sharing company, is facing some big challenges in two huge markets, California and New York. In California, Labor Relations Board ruled that employees are employees, and they're not just people using the app to find rides, as Uber likes to call them, so Uber doesn't have to provide benefits to their employees. Now in California, they may. It's not binding yet, but they may have to start providing benefits and treating drivers as actual employees.
Well, this will be a big blow to the company, right, and its business model.
It'll be very costly, but it can actually start to help shape the sharing economy so that workers in that economy are treated fairly.
Well, thank you, as ever, for your insight. We do appreciate it. Daniel Roth here at the Economy Show. That wraps up our global economic coverage today. Do stay tuned tomorrow for all the latest in global business and innovation tomorrow. Same time, same place at the Jaffa Port. I'm Natalie Ehrlich. Thank you for watching.